But one farmer says, seems to me there was a tea party in Boston that was illegal too.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
We shall seek to establish and maintain a dollar which will not change its purchasing and debt-paying power during the succeeding generation.
As anguished shrieks rose up from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange.
Government credit and government currency are really one and the same thing. A reserve of gold and a small reserve of silver.
Why do central banks hold it?
Well, it's a form of reserves.
Why don't they hold diamonds?
Well, it's tradition, long-term tradition.
Well, some people still think it's money.
All right, welcome back to the Junius Maltby channel. You know, this topic that we're going to cover today in two articles, one from a mainstream outlet, the HuffPost, and one from a less mainstream outlet, the von Mises Institute, the Austrian School of Economics, cover the same topic of gold confiscation and the situation that America went through during the Great Depression in the 1930s under FDR. We've covered this topic extensively on this channel. It's one of those pivotal points in history that we often have to refer back to, point to, discuss, because of how horrendous it truly was in an assault towards private property rights, towards the rights of all Americans, and towards the economic rights of not only the people in this country, but the globe, and the course that it set us onto, and all the consequences that we have to live with because of these statist and tyrannical acts. Now, many of you might not like to sit here through readings of particular articles and think, oh, I can read them myself. Well, that's fine. You can go ahead and do that. But, you know, I will interject things here and there. We will also break it down and have discussions, and there will be discussions in the comments. But I feel it, I don't know, I had a feeling recently. I was reading these articles on my own for my own good, and I just felt, you know what, I need to cover this again. I need to go through these, at least these two pieces. I've never done these two articles that we're going to talk about here on the channel, although they do cover and review some of the same content that we've discussed at length. But again, that is the purpose of this channel. So if you don't like to hear me reading through certain articles, you can go ahead and click the pause or stop button, or you can click the little X in the upper right corner of the screen, or just go to another website. I think The Voice or Dancing with the Stars might be on. You might even be able to catch on YouTube a couple episodes of The Bachelor or The Bachelorette. So go ahead and do that if you would like, or maybe Justin Bieber, watch him singing. And good luck, have fun with that. But today I want to talk about gold being illegal, gold being confiscated, and a lot of the information that is tied to that. We're going to have to review the history, of course, you know, what precipitated it, how it was done, and these two articles, I think, will help many of us, especially new people. If you're new to the channel, you know, we've gained a lot of subscribers in the last 6 months or so that might not be familiar with this. So if you're one of the veteran Junius Maltby subscribers, and I know there's a lot of you veterans, some of you that were in the first 2,000 subs, and some of you in the first 20,000. Well, now we're sitting at 27,300 or so. So we've got several thousand people that might not be familiar with this story. They might not have gone into the archives and researched it. And I think for any person who's interested in precious metals and the fundamental understanding of why we should possess them and own them, and the power that they offer, the power that they truly do hold in separating yourself from the monopoly of currency issuance by the state, preserving one's wealth, and also to realize that the state, the powers that be, truly view gold as an enemy of the state. It's a threat to their monopoly, a threat to their power. Because remember, power is the ability to issue money, fiat, at will. And gold is real money, and they can't. They can't issue it at will. All they can do is steal it and confiscate it, because that's what government truly is good at, is confiscating and stealing wealth. They do not create it. That is a major mythology. Governments do not create wealth. If they created wealth, there would be no poor people, right? They don't. They just steal and take away. So let's continue here. Let's go into this. Let's read it. And welcome again to the Junius Maltby channel. Prepare to be challenged. I was somewhat surprised when I stumbled upon this article from the HuffPost. Yes, it is dated. I believe it's from 2017. but it's titled When Owning Gold Was Illegal in America and Why It Could Be Again. D-Dub, I hope you're sitting down with your popcorn, so let us begin. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected President of the United States by promising to end the Great Depression, which had driven the national unemployment rate up to 25% and gutted the economy. Sound familiar? During his presidential campaign, FDR promised to lower government spending and taxes and balance the budget. Those are pretty hefty promises there, my man. Once in office, he did the exact opposite. A politician doing the opposite of what they said. I'm riveted by this opening. FDR's government spent more in an effort to create jobs and increase consumer demand. He raised taxes to fund the hike in spending, as well key government services. All of this was meant to stimulate the economy while assisting struggling American households in order to bring the nation out of the depths of the economic depression that had begun with the 1929 stock market crash. FDR quickly realized, however, that he could not print enough money to pay for his spending program, even by increasing taxes. The Federal Reserve Act of 1914 limited the amount of money that could be printed by the government. All Federal Reserve notes, paper money, had to be backed by 40% gold owned by the federal government. It wasn't even 1-to-1 and they couldn't do it, my friends. It was just 40% and they couldn't do that. In other words, for every dollar printed, the government needed 40 cents of gold in the bank. FDR outlaws gold. One of FDR's first acts as president, therefore, was to declare the fact that Americans were withdrawing their gold and currency from the beleaguered banking system a, quote, national emergency. He ordered all banks to close from March 6th through the 9th in order to prevent the export, hoarding, or earmarking of gold or silver coin or bullion or currency. Because he believed this action was not sufficient to prevent runs on banks and the resulting drain of gold from the system, on April 5th, 1933, 1 month after taking office, Roosevelt used the powers granted to the president by the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 to make gold ownership illegal. Pause. The fact that we were abandoned and betrayed by Congress, the legislative branch who should have held him in check, as well as the Supreme Court, shows you that there is truly no function to the checks and balances system of this government. It was broken long ago. He should have been, honestly, removed from office immediately for these absolute usurpations and violations of the Constitution, and the people should have risen up and done something. But of course they couldn't because they were essentially starving, broken, poor. Communication systems didn't exist like they do today. Imagine how difficult it was during this time period. So in 1917, he used the Trading with the Enemy Act to make gold ownership illegal. He issued Executive Order 6102, we've done an entire video on this, which made gold ownership both in coins and in bars illegal for all Americans and punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Back then, and during the time period from there till 1974, you could essentially get more prison time and harsher penalties for owning the inert periodic table of the elements metal known as gold, AU, than you could for owning or possessing perhaps heroin or cocaine. It was contraband. It was illegal to own this completely harmless metal. Well, it's not harmless. That tells you that, right? Because it's harmful to the state. It's a threat to their power. It's their Achilles heel. It's like the kryptonite to Superman, to the superstate. Gold is the kryptonite to the superstate. I like that. I think we'll keep that. We'll coin that here. No pun intended. We'll coin that as a term on this channel. So 6102 made gold ownership in both coins and bars illegal for all Americans and punishable by up to 10 years in prison. We have to reiterate that. Very low conviction rate, however, even though that was a very low compliance rate from what I've always gathered and read. Anyone caught with gold would also have to pay a fine of twice the amount of gold that was not turned over to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper money. That wasn't money, it was paper currency. Americans required to hand gold into the government. There's a headline there from the New York Times. It reads, Roosevelt orders 4-day bank holiday, puts embargo on gold, calls Congress. All Americans were required to turn in their gold on or before May 1st, 1933, to the Federal Reserve in return for $20.67 of paper money per troy ounce. Americans who did not turn in their gold were subject to arrest on criminal charges and faced up to 10 years in federal prison. Remember, when you don't obey or comply with the state, you have two choices. You can die, or men with guns will come to your home and take you away and put you in a cage. That's it. You only have two choices. Cage or death. That is how the state works. That's the function of it. That's their role. And it's very clear in their edicts. An exception, of course, was made for dentists who could own up to 100 ounces. Proclamation 6102 also prohibited the use of gold in contracts. So there you have the government intervening itself and involving itself in private contracts and dealings between two participants or parties, the individuals. This was upheld by the Supreme Court on March 1935 in what were called the Gold Clause cases. We're going to review some of those during this video. Millions of Americans waited in long lines to hand in their gold. Many photos from this era are often cited as examples of people getting their money out of the banks when in fact they were simply turning in their gold in accordance with FDR's new laws. These are the same people that would put masks on today because they're told to and do whatever the state orders them to do for the benefit of the state. These are your sheeple. These are the people that can't think for themselves. They have no independent thought. They were probably paying attention to whatever reality type show or this whatever was equivalent to that existed at the time. Complete ignoramuses, and you know the type. You see them, you pass them in traffic, you've shopped next to them at Costco or any of the malls or stores that you've ever been to. These are your standard and typical zombie citizen. They have no mind. They're just robotons, NPCs. Okay, these are your little gray-faced NPC. That's what these people are. With gold and paper money now separated, FDR was able to increase the federal deficit by issuing bonds, debt, in exchange for paper money. He used the paper money raised through government bond issues to pay for the many government programs he initiated as part of his New Deal program. Sadly, FDR's New Deal did not end the Great Depression. Instead, in 1937, the stock market collapsed by 90% and unemployment soared. Then, in the 1970s, the U.S. government removed the last remaining restraint on federal government deficits. Nixon ends the gold standard. At that time, foreign countries could exchange dollars they received through international trade for gold held by the American government at $32 per ounce. In 1971, gold started to pour out of the U.S. government's stockpile due to large deficits in both the federal budget and the trade balance. I actually think the author of this article got that wrong, and it is $35 per ounce because that's what FDR revalued gold at after stealing it from the American people. So again, it poured out of the U.S. government stockpile due to large deficits in both the federal budget and the trade balance. At 9 p.m., as you've seen in the intro to most of the videos here, on August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon gave a televised speech to the nation announcing that he was taking the dollar off the gold standard. And remember, he uses the word temporarily. Of course, anything the government does when they say temporarily means permanent because it still exists. There is no dollar pegged to gold. So he gave that televised speech. You've seen it. He announced that it was taking the dollar off the gold standard, and this move enabled the dollar to float freely against other currencies and removed the final obstacle to ballooning federal deficits and trade imbalances. The prohibition against owning gold wasn't uplifted until 1974, when President Gerald Ford, unaware that it was a federal felony to own gold. Again, remember what I've told you, politicians don't even know these things exist. They don't even know this history. They're completely ignorant to it. Nobody in Congress, save maybe one or two, no governors, most people that sit as judges in courts around this country, nobody is aware or familiar with this tale in this story. It's complete ignorance. They're all NPCs at this point. Again, this is the president, Gerald Ford. He was unaware that it was a federal felony to own gold. He saw a sound money advocate, Jim Blanchard, on TV raising a bar of gold and asking from his wheelchair, "Why can I not own this?" Ford signed Proclamation 93-373, which legalized gold ownership and also made it legal to include gold clauses in contracts, effective 1977. Ford failed, however, to reestablish gold as a backup to government fiat or the American dollar. Deficits climb and the dollar falls. As a result, deficits continued to mount. Today, the U.S. federal deficit is at 19 trillion. Shows you the dating of this article. No, we'll say today it's 25.4 trillion, with another 70 trillion in off-balance sheet debt, and that sits around, I think, 80 or 90 trillion. So it's ballooned significantly since even the penning of this article, which can be triggered if certain individuals or institutions renege on debts that the federal government has guaranteed. The purchasing power of the U.S. dollar has precipitously declined as well. Channel, having displayed it before. There you can see 1913, the Federal Reserve was created on the left side there. And this is the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar from 1913 to 2013. And it has since even worsened from here. And you can see it just decline, losing over 95, 96% or more of its value. I think it's even greater, about 98%. I mean, it's gone. I mean, there's no exchangeability with gold. And the amount of fiat paper dollars it takes to purchase gold now compared to what it was back then, if you use gold as the real sound money, the real standard and ultimate extinguisher of debt, it has grown significantly since this. And you can see there Nixon closing the gold window, and there in 2013 about 5 cents worth of purchasing power compared to 1913. Do today's presidential candidates think the same way? Well, most of them are completely, all of them, essentially, unless you refer back to Ron Paul running in 2008 and 12, they have no idea about this story. To hear several U.S. presidential candidates, even recently, remark that, quote, "we can always print more money," is disturbing. And now think if today we're looking at modern monetary theory and it's being accepted and adopted, no reserves, unending printing, stimulus, quantitative easing, trillions upon trillions of dollars created as digits on a screen and injected into the false zombie economy. It was that line of thinking, first with FDR and later with Nixon, that instigated today's mounting deficits and the dollar's declining purchasing power. Printing more money is fraught with the very real risk of creating high rates of inflation that will destroy the purchasing power of the dollar further and potentially damage every American's savings and the livelihoods of people living on fixed incomes, such as Social Security, pensions, you name it. Could the federal government ever move to seize gold from American citizens again? When the government nationalized gold coin and bullion nearly 80 years ago, it gave Americans less than a month to turn in their gold. It's hard to imagine this happening again, but it's important to be aware of the very real history of gold confiscation in the U.S. and to be conscious of the economic pressures that could make a president decide to take such action again. Beg the question, I wonder. Now let that mainstream HuffPost article serve as the introduction. Now we will refer to the Mises Daily articles, The Great Gold Robbery of 1933. This is from August 13th, 2008 by Thomas E. Woods, Jr. It's been 75 years since the federal government, on the spurious grounds of fighting the Great Depression, ordered the confiscation of all monetary gold from Americans, permitting trivial amounts for ornamental or industrial use. This happens to be one of the episodes Kevin Gutzman and I describe in detail in our new book, Who Killed the Constitution? The Fate of American Liberty from World War I to George W. Bush. From the point of view of the typical American classroom, on the other hand, the incident may as well not have occurred. A key piece of legislation in this story is the Emergency Banking Act of 1933, which Congress passed on March 9th without having read it and after only the most trivial debate. House Minority Leader Bertrand H. Snell, Republican, New York, generously conceded that it was, quote, entirely out of the ordinary, unquote, to pass legislation that, quote, is not even in print at the time it is offered, unquote. He urged his colleagues to pass it all the same. Quote, the House is burning down, and the President of the United States says this is the way to put out the fire. And then there was a round of applause. And to me, at this time, there is only one answer to this question, and that is to give the President what he demands and says is necessary to meet the situation, unquote. Among other things, the act retroactively approved the President's closing of private banks throughout the country for several days the previous week, an act for which he had not bothered to provide a legal justification. It gave the Secretary of the Treasury the power to require all individuals and corporations to hand over all their gold coin, gold bullion, or gold certificates, if, in his judgment, quote, such action is necessary to protect the currency system of the United States. The Emergency Banking Act reached back in time to amend the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which had originally been intended to criminalize economic intercourse between American citizens and declared enemies of the United States. One provision of the act granted the President the power to regulate and even prohibit, quote, under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe, any transactions in foreign exchange, export, or earmarkings of gold or silver coin or bullion or currency by any person within the United States, unquote. And you've often heard me refer to that, the illegality of transacting with precious metals with another party in any transaction as being a violation of the Trading with the Enemy Act, and it still stands. In 1918, the act was amended to extend its provisions 2 years beyond the conclusion of hostilities and to allow the President to investigate, regulate, or prohibit even the, quote, hoarding of gold by an American. After those 2 years elapsed, people generally assumed that the Trading with the Enemy Act had passed into desuetude, but the Supreme Court later explained that the Act's provisions were not limited merely to World War I and the 2 years that followed. It, quote, stood ready to meet additional wars and additional enemies, unquote, and could be called into service once again under those circumstances. Little did anyone suspect in 1917 that these, quote, additional enemies would turn out to be the American people themselves. As amended by the Emergency Banking Act of 1933, the Trading with the Enemy Act no longer said that simply, quote, during times of war, unquote, could the President prohibit the export of gold or take action against, quote, hoarding, i.e., holding on to one's money. Now, these actions could be taken during time of war or, quote, during any other period of national emergency declared by the President. A month later, claiming authority from the Emergency Banking Act and its amendment to the Trading with the Enemy Act, the President ordered all individuals and corporations in America to hand over their gold holdings to the federal government in exchange for an equivalent amount of paper currency. The paper currency they were receiving in exchange for the gold had always been redeemable in gold in the past, so few saw anything amiss in this coerced transaction, and most trusted the government's assurances that this was somehow necessary in order to combat the Depression. Only later would they discover that they weren't getting that gold back, and that the paper dollars they were being given in exchange would be devalued. Soon, only foreign governments and central banks would be able to convert dollars into gold, and even that link to gold would be severed in 1971. On June 5th, 1933, at the behest of the President, Congress took the next step, passing a joint resolution making it illegal to, quote, require payment in gold or a particular kind of coin or currency or in an amount in money of the United States measured thereby, unquote. Any provision in a private or public contract promising payment in gold was thereby nullified. Payment could be made in whatever the government declared to be legal tender, and gold could not be used even as a yardstick for determining how much paper money would be owed. For the next 6 months, President Roosevelt pursued an erratic monetary course. Every day, a new gold price was declared on a basis no one could figure out. Private lending, in effect, came to a halt, with the value of the dollar in constant flux amid the prospect of ongoing devaluation. As Senator Carter Glass, Democrat Virginia, put it, quote, No man outside of a lunatic asylum will loan his money today on a farm mortgage, unquote. And thus the government could triumphantly announce that since the private sector was cruelly depriving Americans of credit, it would have to step in and provide relief. Meanwhile, Senator William Borah was assuring his countrymen that when it came to the nation's monetary system, there is no limitation upon the power of Congress. It is not circumscribed in any respect whatever. It is given full and plenary power to deal with that subject, and therefore it is the same as if there were no Constitution whatever, unquote. Borah also tried to argue that, quote, when an individual takes an obligation payable in gold, unquote, he does so, quote, with the full understanding that the government may change its monetary policy at any time, and that he must accept whatever the Congress says at a particular time shall constitute money, unquote. The general rule, to which there are occasional exceptions, that no senator should ever be listened to on anything holds here. The power of Congress over money is in fact very limited. It has the power to, quote, coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures, unquote. And that's taken right from the Constitution. Coining money simply refers to the process of taking a precious metal, converting it into coins, and stamping those coins with an indication of their metal content. The power to regulate the value of money does not involve a power to dilute the value of money by inflation, an absurd and self-serving rendering. Regulation of the value of money is a power of declaration and comparison whereby some monetary standard is compared to other coins in circulation, and an exchange rate for these various kinds of currency established according to the amounts of precious metals, with due allowance for the distinct values of different precious metals, in each. In other words, if Congress were to declare by statute what the prevailing market exchange rate between gold and silver was, and thus to, quote, regulate gold and silver coins vis-a-vis one another, or more precisely vis-a-vis the Spanish silver dollar that constituted the American monetary standard, then it would be properly exercising its constitutional power, which consists of nothing more than this. That is why this power appears in the same clause with the power to, quote, fix the standard of weights and measures, unquote, which involves the measurement of fixed standards in order to assure uniformity throughout the nation. That power does not give Congress the power to declare that 1/10 of a pound shall now be declared a pound, but to take an already existing standard and codify it. Every single monetary statute enacted from the ratification of the Constitution until the 1930s understood the congressional power to regulate the value of money, not in the sense of declaring money to possess some arbitrary value that suits the whims of politicians or central bankers, but in the sense of establishing the relative values of gold and silver coins in the terms of the ever-shifting relative values of those metals on the free market. Needless to say, the market is perfectly capable of doing this on its own. Moreover, the dollar was not an arbitrary term at the time the Constitution was drafted, and all of you should be familiar with this piece of history. In the late 18th century, everyone knew what the dollar referred to: the silver Spanish milled dollar, which was in widespread use in the United States. And if you want to get reference, go back and watch the videos here titled what the definition of a dollar was, the true definition and history of the word dollar. It's very important as it relates to this topic of conversation. So the Spanish milled dollar, which was in widespread use in the United States, that's what a dollar was. The Constitution twice refers to the dollar. In Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, a clause that everyone understood to involve a tax on the import of slaves, and in the 7th Amendment, which protected the right to a jury trial in civil cases involving at least $20. If the dollar had been something that Congress could manipulate at will, or if, quote, dollar had been merely a generic term to refer to whatever Congress would arbitrarily choose to recognize as currency, the South would never have accepted that clause, or the Constitution itself. Congress might have manipulated the dollar so as to make the tax on slave imports prohibitively expensive. It could also have effectively abolished trial by jury in civil cases by making $20 an astronomically high amount of money. The court never pronounced upon the constitutionality of the gold seizure. For reasons we speculate on in our book, the legality of which it simply took for granted. The cases it chose to hear involved the cancellation of gold clauses in public and private contracts, known as the Gold Clause cases. Norman v. Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, Nortz v. United States, and Perry v. United States were argued in January 1935 and decided the following month. In each case, Chief Justice Charles Evan Hughes wrote the opinion for the court. Justice McReynolds composed a single dissent that he applied to all three. The court declared in the first two cases that the federal government had been entitled to cancel all private contracts in gold. The perpetuation of gold clauses would have amounted to the, quote, attempted frustration, unquote, of the, quote, constitutional power of the Congress over the monetary system of the country. These clauses interfere with the exertion of the power granted to the Congress, unquote. Not a stitch of evidence existed for any aspect of this argument. Perry, the third case, involved a man who had purchased in gold a U.S. bond that was payable in gold and was seeking payment either in gold or in the equivalent in paper currency, since the government intended to pay in depreciated dollars. He believed he was receiving far less than he was entitled to under the terms of the bond. The bond's face value was $10,000 in gold. In the inflated dollars of post-gold standard America, it would have taken nearly 17,000 U.S. dollars in paper currency in order to satisfy what the government had contracted to pay him. The court declared that the plaintiff was indeed entitled to his gold, since the government had an obligation to live up to its promises. But in not paying him his gold, the government wasn't really wronging him, since gold was now illegal to hold. In other words, if the government paid him in gold, it would then have to confiscate that gold from him anyway, since holding gold was against the law. Speaking for the minority, Justice McReynolds declared, and here's Justice McReynolds' quote, "Just men regard repudiation and spoliation of citizens by their sovereign with abhorrence, but we are asked to affirm that the Constitution has granted power to accomplish both. No definite delegation of such a power exists, and we cannot believe that the far-seeing framers, who labored with hope of establishing justice and securing the blessings of liberty, intended that the expected government should have authority to annihilate its own obligations and destroy the very rights which they were endeavoring to protect. Not only is there no permission for such actions, they are inhibited, and no plenitude of words can conform them to our charter." To the argument that the bondholder had suffered no damage in being denied payment in gold since it was now illegal for people to own gold, the dissent replied, "Obligations cannot be legally avoided by prohibiting the creditor from receiving the thing promised. There would be no serious difficulty in estimating the value of 25.8 grains of gold in the currency now in circulation. The contract to pay in gold having been broken, the holder was at least morally entitled to receive in currency not just the nominal amount of the bond, but an amount in paper dollars equivalent to what he would have earned if the payment could have been made in gold. Quote, "For the government to say, we have violated our contract, but have escaped the consequences through our own statute, would be monstrous. In matters of contractual obligation, the government cannot legislate so as to excuse itself," unquote. Suppose a private individual tried to do the same thing, quote, secreting or manipulating his assets with the intent to place them beyond the reach of creditors, unquote. Any such attempt, quote, would be denounced as fraudulent, wholly ineffective, unquote. Quote, "Loss of repudiation for honorable dealing," unquote, the dissent concluded, quote, "will bring us unending humiliation. The impending legal and moral chaos is appalling," unquote. Oh, and do we ever live in an environment of legal and moral chaos? And it is truly appalling. We live in a post-constitutional state, a post-Bill of Rights state. The America today is not the America that was designed or set out by the forebears and the founders, the forefathers. At all. I mean, this is a completely corrupt system at this point, and we're seeing it unfold, and we're seeing the consequences of it every single day. But let's continue before we conclude. By the 1970s, the federal government had once again permitted Americans to hold gold coins, but when it came time to actually mint them again, it made sure that gold coins could never circulate and displace the constantly depreciating paper currency printed by the U.S. government. The law required that such coins could circulate with a face value only a tiny fraction of their market value. The full story of the gold confiscation is actually much worse than this, and we tell it in Who Killed the Constitution? What this episode teaches us is not so much that we need to return to the Constitution, though that would be an improvement over what we have now, but rather that pieces of paper that governments themselves interpret cannot be expected to prevent governments from doing what they think they can get away with. Perfect example is recently, my friends. They will violate anything they so wish when the time arises or the crisis arises. They never waste a good crisis. Lysander Spooner once said that he believed that by false interpretations and naked usurpations, the government has been made in practice a very widely and almost wholly different thing from what the Constitution itself purports to authorize. At the same time, he could not exonerate the Constitution, for it, quote, has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. It is hard to argue with that. And that concludes today's readings on the gold confiscation and what took place during that time period. I mean, there are volumes of articles, volumes of information regarding this window in time, this particular piece of history. And it really has become the torch that this channel, I think, carries. And it's my mission to spread this information, this knowledge, because as you saw earlier, even presidents, those who hold the highest office of government, are completely unaware and ignorant of this history. So as you're sitting there in your homes around the world, and your kids are being withheld from school and forced to stay at home in school, which that might be a good thing, perhaps you can assign them this. Assign them a research paper on the Gold Confiscation Act. Videos such as this. Have them do their own research and look up the articles. The Federal War on Gold by Jacob Hornberger. And all the Supreme Court cases surrounding this. Knox versus Lee, Hepburn versus Griswold. The cases mentioned in this article. And how the United States government committed one of the most heinous acts of criminality, dishonesty, and theft perpetrated by any government ever. Any person who agrees with the acts of FDR at this time, the Gold Confiscation Act, the Trading with the Enemy Act, and all of it, is by nature a statist, an enemy of liberty, an enemy of freedom. Those gray-faced NPCs are no countryman and brother of mine. Now these individuals that exist out there circulating amongst us, these zombie citizens, they don't care. All they want is to exist in the matrix and have their stake. They don't want to know the truth because it's too uncomfortable. They'd rather live in whatever constructed design, whatever the architects of tyranny have built around them to comfort them, to entertain them. They would rather exist in that than know the discomfort of possibly having to fend for themselves or live in a world of sound money, true liberty, consequences of decisions. They want to live entertained and fat and ignorant. And that's the world we exist in now. Is it changeable? I don't know. Is there a way to reverse the course? I do not think so. I don't believe that there will be a move to confiscate metals again. However, I do believe they will continue to construct legal hurdles and make the dealings with precious metals extremely difficult through taxation and regulations and such as that. We're entering a new time period, obviously. I mean, something that FDR could have only dreamed of with modern monetary theory. And at this point, precious metals are going to skyrocket. That's a given. Anyone who doesn't see the trends, anyone who doesn't realize what's happening, well, they'll be left in the dust. My last word here before we close out today's discussion would be defend your metals to the death, honestly. Never relinquish them, hide them, hoard them, secure them. Never disclose that you have them. Of course, you know that we all do, but there's ways of getting around that. What are they going to do, torch you? As Nathan Hale would say, I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. And you know what? That's the mindset you have to adopt. Never again. Learn your lesson. We saw these individuals back then fooled in receiving fiat currency in place of their gold, only to realize they'll never get it back, only to realize that it had been hoarded away, melted into bars, and locked up in the newly established and built Fort Knox by the United States government, given to the Federal Reserve, the private banking cabal that seized control over the United States. And then seeing their new issued paper lose value overnight by 60, 70% when the gold was revalued to $35 an ounce. We saw their contracts annihilated. They were fooled. But you will not fool us again. Never again should any person on this planet willfully hand over metals to the state. So continue to buy precious metals and realize that when you do so, you're pissing off the statists. You're pissing off the tyrants because they want that metal for themselves, ultimately. I was watching on the U.S. debt clock the gold hoards, the largest stacks at the central banks, last night, and I noticed a troubling trend. The numbers were dwindling. All across the board, all nations right now, on the U.S. debt clock. The amount of gold held in their reserves is decreasing, not increasing. And at the United States, if you look at theirs, it's at a pretty significant rate right now. Something to consider. So continue stacking, my friends. And remember, gold is the enemy of the state.